here. I hope everything is okay with you and your home, and also with your tests, some tests. So before we continue this morning, I would like to review about your paper titles. Yeah. So that we have descriptions. I have not finished checking in detail all your papers. So maybe next week I will share the score, the detailed score. But I have overview all the papers so that I know the whole map of our topic and your papers. So you can see it on your screens. I need to comment so that your final test will be much better. Yeah. This one in the brackets, it is the initial of your name, so you know your papers. So the first problem is there are some students writing a paper without title. So this is a very serious problem, because if a paper without title is just like somebody without a name, how can we address it? Yeah. So I'll show you, for example, number 14. This is the number 14. Little women using feminism without title. Yeah. And then we have also, sorry, number 10. Till I rise. Using feminism, this is your issue without title as well. Yeah. And then we have number 19. American Psycho, using psychoanalysis without title. And then number 24, I told Sunset about you using queer theory without title. Yeah. But there are 4 students writing without titles, and that is serious. Yeah. So make sure that in the final test, because the final test will be absolutely a paper again. So the instruction is come up with an interesting title that reflect the content of your papers. What you are going to talk about is clearly seen in the title. Yeah. So here, beside there is no title, there are some with title, but it is the title of the literary work. For example, we have number 6, Mulan. What you are going to talk about Mulan? Mulan can be approached in any way. Yeah. Number 7, the saying. Films. Yeah. The animations. Also without title. Same as no title, actually, we would just mention the name of the literary work for the film. Yeah. Okay, so no one has mentioned the title of the work. Because good papers really reflects what you are going to talk about. Yeah. For example, number 16, we have postmodernism theory. Yeah, you mentioned the we don't know what you're going to talk about. So don't just mention the title or the theory. Yeah, don't mention only the title and the theory. Okay. Yeah. All right. And then I'll move to something more detailed. For example, number 4, feminist criticism on Marlena, the murderer in 4 acts. So it's talking about the, Agatha Christie. Yeah? That is a modern adaptation and modern works on a murderer's story. Now, this title is quite okay because it reflects what it is. Yeah. Okay. And then we have similar. Yeah. I just say it is okay. It is not excellent yet. Yeah, it is okay. Yeah. We have also structuralism in title and word points. The review of feminist criticism in Desires Baby. Yeah. Mulan movie analyze. Remember, we have a grammar 10% evaluations. Yeah. So for example, you say Mulan movie analyze. Analyze is a verb. You cannot say Mulan movie analyze. You have to say Mulan movie analysis or analyzing Mulan's movie. That's will be grammatically correct, but this one grammatically wrong. So not only the title, I will go through the content, and the English is also 10%. We have to do this, 10% of the scoring. So make sure that the English is also okay. Example number 13 is also the same. Analyze of the movie Little Women is in feminist perspective. And analyze. Analyze is a verb. It should be an analysis. Yeah. Or if you want to use verb, make it into gerund. Analyzing. Yeah. Analyzing. Without off. Analyzing the movie Little Women. Or analysis. If you want to have now. Okay, please, you are English Common student, you have to be expert on that. Okay. And then going to my okay titles, yeah. Structuralist number 11, structuralist criticism on William Shakespeare Hamlet. Okay. And then feminist criticism of the McCarthy Princess of the Fall. Similar, yeah. And then the feminism in Anna becomes poems. Yeah. Alright. So those titles are okay. Yeah, okay. But not excellent. Let's go on with the others. The last one, 26, analysis of the story of another by Beethoven using structuralism theory. Understanding translator in equal heteronormativity and homophobia in Broadway mountains. Now, number 23, yeah, is the excellent title. Yeah. So, do you know why it is excellent? Anyone can share one example of it? good, very good title is number 23. Yeah. Give an example. 21. The reflections of radical feminism in movie Mustang. That is a good title. So you can see why it's good, yeah. And then number 22 is also good. Yeah. The movie hidden figures through the lens of artists. And then number 20 is also quite good. Yeah. Freud psychoanalysis, which is on the character Desmond because in observations by Mel Gibson. That's a good title. Not excellent, good. Okay. Number 80, a queer perspective lesbian P in the film Right or Wrong. This is also good. Yeah. So do you know why it is good? Why it is only okay? Why it is excellent? So this is only based on the title. Any comment? Anyone?
Sir, is it because the title is very specific?
Very specific. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, thank you. So a good title of a paper is a very short discussion of a topic. Yeah. Even a thesis, which is quite broad, should be specific as well. Not to mention a paper, which is very specified topic to be discussed in, let's say, only 4 pages. Yeah. So the title must be specific. Yeah. So that's why number the one that I mentioned, yeah, for example, number 23, heteronormativity is a very specific topic, and also homophobia is a very specific topic in queer theory. Yeah. These two issues will be elaborated clearly using queer theory. Yeah. You don't have to say queer theory, feminism, structuralism, postmodernism. No. By a specific term, jargon, using the theory, you know that it is that theory is what. Yeah. For example, homophobia, of course, it is not structuralism. It's not feminism. Homophobia specifically talk about queer theory. Yeah. And then mention the title of the work. It's all very important. Yeah, it's not somewhere unclear, but it is on, for example, Broadback Mountains. Yeah. Okay, same as the others. Radical feminism. Feminism is very broad. Okay, you can have tons of topic about feminism. Yeah, you can focus on the radical topic. Yeah, radical issues of feminism. Yeah, and then Freud criticism, Freud psychoanalysis criticism. Yeah, in the character of destinies. If you can go a bit specific, it will be excellent. So what kind of characters will be discussed? Yeah, if you can label it with, let's say, the character is kind of unique characters of this one, yeah, and you mention it in the title, that will be excellent. Yeah. This is only good. Yeah. Okay, so good title must be specific. Yeah. Specific and is clear what you are going to talk about, which word, yeah, and then what issues. It doesn't have to be the thing, but it's, yeah. We are talking about structuralism in Hairil Anwar points. You know, there are a lot of Hairil Anwar points. And then what we are going to talk about, which one? Yeah, it's very general. Yeah. So that's only okay. Yeah. Unclear. Any questions about this? So next week, normally I will take note on your papers. Yeah. You can discuss with me. So when I issue the score and you are not satisfied, you can discuss. But remember, there's a time limit. Okay. I'll show you, but it's not distributed really, because Venus has a rule. It's only student to lecture discussions, yeah, to make it easy. Yeah. So if you need the paper, you can contact me. I will show you, and then I'll take it. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, for example, silakan. For example, number feminism on people. Number two, yeah. You know, number two, feminism will becomes milk and honey. Yeah, by yeah, that's your ideas. So I assume that I don't know the feminist topic discussed in the point. I don't know which one because there are a lot of issues about feminism in the points. Yeah. So if you change feminism, let's say with center phrase that reflects feminist issues. For example, women's autonomy, women's independence, women's silence. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Women's resistance. In will be power, milks, and honey. That will be access. Okay? So feminism itself is very broad, but it is okay as a title. But you can have a better one. Yeah. Be specific what it is discussed. Yeah. And it will help you to focus your writing, so you don't write any things outside your topic mentioned in the titles. Somebody we are talking about silence as resistance in Ruby Cloud's points. The title is very clear. That will be excellent. You will be focusing on talking about what expression that reflect silence and resistance. Okay, I hope this is a good lesson for all of us. So don't repeat this in the final test. So remember this one. The worst problem is no title. So don't ever do it. You suddenly start introductions. Yeah, no title at all. So no, don't repeat that. That is the worst one. Number two, you just mentioned the theory, postmodernism. Yeah, what is it? It's not clear. Yeah, or you mention title of the words. Yeah, Little Women. What you are going to do with that? It's not clear. And then you have a very general title, feminism or postmodernism in blah blah blah. Too general. Yeah, go to a specific issues. Yeah. So after this, I'll check the detail of the papers. Yeah. Maybe this time I will concentrate on your ideas. Okay, so don't worry about that. Your ideas is still brilliant, it's still good. You can still have them. Yeah, but there is no compromise in the final test. Okay, so that's why I tell you this today. Yeah, the weaknesses, and then so that you can improve yourself in the final test. So once again, I will be focusing on your ideas. Right? Okay. Now we have to move our topic. According to the syllabus, today we are going to talk about I will just start with one video to trigger our discussion. All right, because our next topic will be about post-colonial literary decisions. So I'd like you to observe this video. Yeah, the title of the video is "The Dangers of a Single Story" or a single narrative. Yeah, the dangers of a single story or a single narrative. So what we can discuss, I think, just observe first the video, and then we will be relating ourselves to this video later on in our discussions. By the way, I think there are groups who are supposed to present today, so be ready. Yeah, we're going to make use of the time to discuss your presentations. Okay, so just enjoy the video, please.
Take the first step towards mastering the art of public speaking by checking out TED Masterclass today.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
All right, so that's quite long video, but this is very essential to our understanding of post-colonialism, our topic today. I will let you present about that. I don't know whether you understand or not the video, and I know that according to the research, people will lose interest if the video is longer than 6 minutes. We know that it's more than 10 minutes. But my point is, when we are going to talk about something seriously, you cannot just see superficial thought of them. So that's the essence of the video. Don't be trapped in a single story about anything. Yeah? Because a single story will create stereotypes. Yeah? This can be applied to anything. Yeah? And stereotype, not only negative, but always, as it said in the video, stereotype is always incomplete. So we just see from a very partial part of the whole idea. And post-colonial literature will also discuss about this. How stereotype about the non-West, non-white is distributed among us, and how we will have critical standing point of that partial representation of what we call non-white, non-West, including us in the Asians. Yeah. All right. So just once again the video, type the title, The Dangers of a Single Story, and then you will see, and then you can understand that. Yeah. Now, I think we have the other group before post-colonial talking about new historicism and cultural materialism. Yeah. Are you ready? According to my notes, how we have Vanessa Sarah and Muhammad Yasir. After that, we are going to have post-colonial, 3 and 8. It sounds like that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So, will be Vanessa.
I'm sorry, sir. I can't share screen because the host is on me.
Vanessa, so, Muhammad Yasir.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'm going to present about new historicism and cultural materialism. I'm gonna present alone today because Muhammad Yasir isn't present today. New historicism is a literary philosophy that argues that literature should be analyzed and understood in the context of both the author's and critics' histories. The term New Historicism was first introduced by Stephen Greenblatt. The New Historicism has become a very influential approach to literature, especially in the study of William Shakespeare's work and literature from the early modern period. It began in earnest in the 1980s and quickly replaced new criticism as the new orthodoxy in early modern studies. It dominated the study of early modern literature in the 1980s and 1990s. New historicism not only in a literary work influenced by its author timing and circumstances, but critics' reactions to that work are often influenced by their setting, values, and prejudice, according to New Historicism. A new historicist examines literature in a broader historical context, looking at how the writer's times influence the work as well as how the work represents the writer's times, while also acknowledging that existing cultural conditions color the critic's conclusions. New historicism and old historicism differences. Old historicism history as written is an accurate view of what is really occurred, while in new historicism, history is subjective. One of many discourse history is shaped by the people who live it. In old historicism, history served as a background to literature, while in new historicism, the interrelatedness of all human activities. Historical textual background is secondarily important because the text mirrors the history of its time, while in New Historicism tries to address focal tireless questioning of the nature of literature, history, culture, and society. In Old Historicism, by applying the historical context to the text, the critic believes that he or she can formulate a more accurate interpretation of text than if they did not know such historical context. While in New Historicism, viewing a text as culture in action, blurring the distinction between an artistic production and any other kind of social production or event. Historical periods evidence a single political worldview, while New Historicism is to unlock textual meaning. A cultural critic investigates three areas of concern: the life of the author, the social rules and dictates found within a text, and a reflection of a work's historical situation as evidence in the text. Michael Foucault. New historicism is always anti-establishment on the side of liberal ideas and personal freedoms. Belief in Michael Foucault's idea of an all-seeing panoptic surveillance state. The panoptic state brings power through rational practice, circulating ideology through body politic. Most new historicism writing based off his work. He believes that historical events are a web of economic, social, and political factors. He saw history in the terms of power. He viewed power as a complex of forces that produce what happens. Examples of new historicism. When analyzing Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, it's hard not to wonder if the play reveals Shakespeare's anti-Semitism. The new historicists realized that this wasn't a straightforward yes or no question that could be deduced from a close analysis of the text. This work must be evaluated in the sense in which it was written. In turn, analyzing the work will expose cultural history. History reveals more about the document, and history reveals more about the text. The new historicist also recognized that his literary study is tainted by his own history and surroundings. The fact that we are questioning if Shakespeare was anti Semitic shows how our interpretation of Shakespeare is conditioned by our civilization. As a result, New Historicism emphasized the impermanence of literary criticism in the same way as literature represents and is represented by its own historical backgrounds. Contemporary literary criticism is informed by and exposes contemporary beliefs. New historicism recognizes and celebrates the fact that our interpretation of great literature evolved with the passage of time. Cultural materialism is a Marxist interpretation of new historicism that involves a radical and subversive study of any historical material within a politicized context. The term is coined by Raymond Williams and popularized by Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfeld. Through an eclectic theoretical approach backed by the political commitment arising from the influence of Marxist and feminist perspectives, cultural materialism emphasizes studying the historical context, looking at those historical aspects that have been discarded or silenced in other historical narratives, and thus executing a textual analysis. Close reading that critiques traditional approach, cultural materialism emphasizes studying the historical context, looking at those historical aspects that have been discarded or silenced in other historical narratives. Cultural materialists like the new historicists believe in the textuality of history and the historicity of text. They are conscious of the political agendas of the text and, as a result, are aware of the ways in which influence is held through the text implied workings of ideology. Although they claim that new historicists create a political readings in which the oppressed have no control, cultural materialists are consciously political and aim to change the social order as they seek readings that reflect on the marginalized and marginalized. generalized, and exploited, they recognize literature's subversive potential for subcultural opposition and recommended dissident reading, which investigates a text's hidden political agenda and power struggles. Cultural materialists analyze how hegemonic powers in culture appropriate canonical and historically relevant texts, such as Shakespeare and Austen, and use them to justify or uphold those ideals in the cultural imaginary. The writers of political Shakespeare, Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield, have had a significant impact on the growth of this movement, and their book is considered a seminal text. As a theoretical device, they have established four distinguishing characteristics of cultural materialism. First, historical context. Second, theoretical method. Three, political commitment. Four, textual analysis. New historicism and cultural materialism differences. New historicism is a method based on the parallel reading of literary texts, while cultural materialism, historical theoretical context, method political textual comment analysis. New historicism have a tendency to concentrate on the less than ideal situations under which they do so, which is the strength of social and ideological systems. The interventions in which men and women make their own history tend to be the focus. A literary text is placed in its own time's political condition, while a cultural materialist places in it ours. Cultural materialism, the former's context are documents contemporary with Shakespeare. What cultural materialists do? They read the literary text in such a way that we can recover its histories or the sense of abuse from which it arose. At the same time, they emphasize the factors in the work's current transmission and contextualization that led to the loss of certain histories in the first place. They combine Marxist and feminist approaches to the text, especially to achieve the first of these goals and to break the previous dominance of conservative social, political, and religious assumptions in Shakespeare criticism. They employ close textual analysis techniques, but they also frequently employ structuralist and post-structuralist techniques, especially to signal a break with the inherited tradition of close textual analysis within the context of conservative cultural and social assumptions. At the same time, they operate primarily within conventional canonical frameworks, arguing that writing about more obscure texts is seldom a strategically successful intervention. The example of cultural materialism. An example of an informal variant of this approach is Terence Hawkes' essay, Thelma. This is the fourth piece in the book, each one being centered on the work of one of the major Shakespearean critics of the early part of the century, within an overall strategy of looking at how Shakespeare is mediated and processed to us. In this chapter, the critic is John Chapter, the critic, best known for his 1930s Dover Wilson. What happens in Hamlet? The opening section consider aspects of Hamlet, emphasizing cyclic and symmetrical elements of the play. The play is culturally transformed when a way of reading it is put among many contexts from 20th century life. Hockey's final reading of the play includes adding an extra stage direction, and his model for this kind of critique is the jazz musician who transforms the, pa- the what he perceives rather than transmitting it. This could be considered a distinguishing attribute of this strain of cultural materialist criticism. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Vanessa, for the presentation. Any questions? Is it clear? The two theories, new historicism and cultural materialism. If you have question, please address it first to group. Questions? Okay. There's no question. I have one just to try. See. What is the basic difference? Just mention one. Yeah, between new historicism and cultural materialisms. What is the difference? Mention one, please, so that we know how to analyze the text.
I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't hear your question clearly.
What is the difference between new historicism, the first theory, and cultural materialism, the second one?
The differences?
Yeah, mention the basic difference, one only.
New historicism is a method based on the parallel reading of literary and non-literary texts, while cultural materialism, historical theoretical context method, political textual comment analysis.
Right. All right. Theoretically, yes. But if I ask you, for example, can you analyze one, one film which is based on history is Titanic, for example. So remember that new historicism and cultural materialism is based on history. Yeah. So the three types based on history. If it is purely imaginative, there is no historical foundation, then we cannot discuss it in these two fields. Okay? So we know that Titanic is based on true events. Yeah. And there are so many other stories based on so we can discuss. For example, in Titanic, how can you discuss this? Is it new tradition and is it cultural? Yes. So that is the question. This is not true. Just try to be happy based on what you understand. Yes? How you be yes, any idea? If Vanessa Sharon is still thinking, have other friends want to say something? So you know that the leading figure of new historicism is who is the leading figure? The theories. Who is the theory? Cultural materialism. So we have two names. The first is Michel Foucault, or Michael Michel. It's a French. Michel Foucault, and the other one is Raymond William as the leading figures of these two things. So Michel Foucault will be new historicism or cultural materialism. Sorry. Self-Foucault. I've discussed it in the slide. Let's see. Can you hear me? Or I'm talking to myself? Yes? Bingung ya? Is it? Vanessa, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Any comments?
No.
Ada komentar?
No.
have two figures. Unit solution that we sell the book, yeah. Not Michael, we sell. And here we have Raymond. Is it clear or is it not clear? Have you tried to read the book? So, this is just to discuss the not to. Yeah. Difficulties you can share. Yeah. About you don't understand. It's okay not to understand. So maybe other friends can understand better. Vanessa, by the way, did Yasir join the discussion with you?
Yes, sir.
Yasir Isro, did he discuss the topic with you?
I can hear you clearly, sir.
Yasir Isro, your friend, did
Yes.
he join you in the discussion to prepare the materials?
In the making PowerPoint.
Yeah, this is group work, right?
Not really.
No, oh, yes. What do you mean not really? This is a very fluid answer. So how did it work? When I did project,
I keep chat him. I keep asking him to uh, work with me, but he always late respond.
So finally,
I made I searched and made it myself.
so then what happened? Did he say something about? I mean, did he find it difficult, or what is the reasons? Do you? Adakah diskusinya?
He wants help me for the GSLC.
All right, but yeah, this is also good for other groups. Yeah. So manage the time better because we have set the schedule long time ago. Yeah, by the help of of course. Yeah. So make use of it. Again, if you have problem, as I said, you can contact me. Yeah. I truly want to help. Yeah. Uh, there is one group, the last group on post manager has contacted me, but because it's still quite long. So please arrange time to discuss with me later about the last group, yeah, post managers. But other groups are also free to contact us. Contact me. Yeah. Because the purpose of this activity is to help us all to be active and also to help us to understand the thing. So if you have problem, we can discuss. Yeah. Kalau menurut Sharon sendiri, is it difficult? Is it difficult, Sharon?
Uh, Quite difficult.
Quite difficult. Sebenarnya nggak terlalu sulit ya. Jadi, ya. Okay, good. Teman-teman yang lain ada yang bertanya nggak? Saya coba overview sebentar ya. Okay, you can see this in your business Maya actually. Yeah. So when we talk about new historicism, the figure is Michel Foucault. Yeah. Michel Foucault used this, you can say on the screen, that is the picture of prisons. Yeah. We call it panoptic surveillance. So a prison is designed by, I think the name is Jeremy Bentham. Yeah, Jeremy Bentham designed this prison. How we have the house, watching house, yeah, in the middle to observe all the prisoners. Yeah, this is what we call panoptic surveillance. So all the prisoners feel watch over by the guard in the towering house in the middle. Yeah. The prisoner cannot see the guard inside the tower. So they feel they are being watched all the time. Yeah, and this is what we call self-discipline. Yeah, this analogy is used for history. Yeah, so whatever written in history is always watched by the power inside the tower. The power is normally the ruling authority. Yeah, it can be the government, it can be kingdom. Yeah, that represent the power. So people cannot write history as they like. History is never objective. History is always appropriated. It's always selected. You choose which one to be written, and you skip any other information, fact, event that you don't include in the history. Okay, so that's the idea of history. So again, history is never objective. Just like this. Yeah. Alternatively, historians, those who write the history, including the filmmakers, yeah, will discipline themselves in line with the power, in line with the authority who is in the middle tower. Yeah, the middle tower. That is the analogy. Once again, history is not objective. It is already selected in line with the power. Okay. I hope that's clear the concept. So this is Jeremy Bentham and so I think I have explained this. Now, Vanessa 7 has explained this, so I try to make it simple. So new historicism is actually coming from American perspective. Yeah. The idea is by Louis Monstrose, the textuality of history and the historicity of text. The textuality of history is history has been textualized into fiction. Titanic is one of the examples. Yeah. So what happened, the events, the reality has been taken into fiction. That is the textuality of history. It can be novel, can be film, can be poems or story and so on. The other way is the historicity of text. Now, the film itself becomes history. We are talking about Hamlet in the story, in the presentation. Hamlet, written by Shakespeare, has been turned into a history as well. So that is the historicity of text. Yeah. So the text itself can be rewritten again. Yeah, just like Hamlet. There is this is by Shakespeare, and then people try to deconstruct Hamlet by rewriting story Thelma. So this is only the other way. Yeah, it is discussed. Thelma is just the inverted version of Hamlet. Yeah, maybe it is the same feminist perspective. So this is what we call the historicity of text. Yeah, literary work fiction has been turning into history. Okay, so you can discuss it. And then the parallel reading of literature and non-literature of the same periods. So you cannot use the past to read the present. No. In history, so you have to do the analysis based on the periods. If you are talking about Titanic, you have to see history in that period. What happened? Who is in power? Why Titanic is written and the way it is? Yeah, you cannot use it now in this moment because the power has been changing. Yeah? Equal weighting of literary and non-literary. So you have to read history, you have to read literature equally. Historical document is called co-text rather than context. Yeah. Why? Because it considers that literary documents, historical documents, as important as the history itself. Yeah. Okay, so that's why it's called co-text, just like pilot and co-pilot, both can fly the planes. Yeah. Not to represent the past as it is, but so the past, the history is not to be presented as it is, but to present a new reality by resituating it. Yeah. Okay. So that's why we have Thelma with a new reality in the new literary works. Yeah. Maybe with a deconstructive view on a feminist approach. All to be self-involved discursive practices. The one that I have explained, yeah, the pen optic, all seeing superiors. So the idea is that discourse is a mental set, it is an ideology, operates not through physical force or nation, but through the power of discursive practices, especially the body politics. It is political pessimism because it is the enforcement of dominant ideology. So it is pessimistic, the tone. wait every time to get the political situation of its own day. So we cannot bring it today. We have to consider it in the time when the work is written. Can open it in the slide. Can you see now cultural materialism? Yes or no? Now, quickly we will discuss about cultural materialism. So it is based on the British. So before we have American, now we have British. Raymond William structures of the. So now we are talking about a politicized form of historiography. But the study of historical materials, including literary texts, within a politicized frameworks. Okay, so um, we pay attention to this. I think Sarah has discussed about this in the presentation, so we just need to see it. So historical context should be seen to recover in histories. Recover means to see the real happen, yeah, the real event that happens in the history. We have theoretical methods such as literal humanism, yeah, but not structuralism or post-structuralism. Yeah, the way to see it. Yeah, political commitment using feminist or Marxist approach to see it. Textual analysis. We also use textual analysis. You can read the poem, you can read the story and analyze it. Yeah. And then to look at the critics of traditional approach. Yeah. So the way we use this is a traditional approach using textual analysis. Now, going back to this Titanic, by the way, do you know the story about Titanic?
Yes.
Yes. So Titanic is really using new historicism and using cultural materialism. The result will be different. If you read it using new historicism, you will try to find, for example, the Titanic movie is very popular at the time. But check the year when the movie is produced. Yeah. And then who is in power? Yeah. Okay. If it is in Hollywood, you can see how is the power of Hollywood. creating this story. Yeah. So who is in power? Remember, the power in fiction, literary works, is not only the government, not only the kingdom, but one thing which is very strong is the publisher. Because it is to sell the works that who is in power. Try to trace that in the story. Yeah. What is missing? Yeah. What is added? It's a part of this question. And then try to relate the film with this. If it is in materialism, it's sometimes called cultural studies. It's more on politics. Yeah. If it is pessimist here, this is optimistic. Because optimistic because they try what can be changed. So politicization of different kinds. Politicization means you have politicized the text for a purpose. For example, you see that the Titanic has been politicized. Actually, there is no characters. Let's say Rose and Jack. No, Rose and Jack. It's only politicized to create interesting story. Yeah. And how to sell this. Yeah. Our politicization not always politics, but it can be on the marketplace. But they have a strong story, and it's proven. People like it, and people can enjoy it. And the story has been politicized. I mean, the history has been politicized. Yeah. Something is not there, it's created as if it was there, and or sell it. Yeah. So that's why it's said Marxists and feminists. A strong approach to this cultural materialism. To see, you can see the Marxists and feminists. See how it's already manipulated, has been politicized for the sake of economy, global purposes, for the sake of market purposes. Okay, that's more or less the topic of cultural materialism and new historicism. Any questions? Question?
Yes, sir.
Good. Please.
I'm not entirely sure, but is the biggest difference between those two is that cultural materialism is more politically driven.
Politically driven.
Yes, compared to new historicism.
Okay. What do you mean by political here? Politically driven.
It's like it talks about. It's like wait, let me see here. It's like it talks more about like the value and the like the production system. It's like I don't know. It feels like more political to me. I don't know why.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So remember the term to be politicized. Again, politicized is not practical politics. Yeah. So to politicize means again to create something in a certain purpose. Yeah. If you mean that is political driven, yes, because it is triggered by its market. Yeah, so it is politicized. It is sometimes it is called manipulated. Yeah, or market wise, market driven. It is yes in cultural materialism because you see materialism, yeah, is a strong keyword. Everything centered around materialism, material words. Yeah. In Marxism, we know that material words control the non-material world. Yeah. Okay. So the answer is yes, political driven. Yeah. If you don't reduce the meaning of politics, yeah, only to practical politics. So in new historicism, when we talk about Michel Foucault prisons analogy, it's not only the power is not always the government or the people. Okay, yeah, I can say once again the publisher is also the power control what will be included, what will be not included. But for example, if you discuss, I think one of your senior has discussed Laskar Pelangi, the same. So Laskar Pelangi talk about the story of education in the era of new order, Orde Baru. But it was written during the Reformation order, not the new order. So it's very different. So what can be included in the story is very different if you imagine it is written in the new order. The Reformation era, you are much more free, yeah, freer to write and criticize it. But there are also politicization of history in Laskar Pelangi. For example, there is no fact that, for example, the student win over the prestigious schools. It is already made up. Yeah. As a just like in mathematics, yeah. The history has been selected and also manipulated. Not as it is, it's not objective. So don't trust anything as if it is history in fiction. It is already done. That's the core of how to critically analyze facts using this. So good question. It is politically driven, yes. More question? No? Now, it is already 11. Actually, we still have 20 minutes because it's until 11:30. But I offer you, do we need to continue with post-colonial presentations? Or we can hold on and then discuss it next. Ideas? Which one do you like? Maybe I will check. What about Putri Salsabila and Ingrid? Are you here? Putri,
Yes, sir.
are you ready to present today?
Sorry, I can hear you clearly.
You're supposed to present today. Are you ready
Yeah.
to present it now or next week? What about Ingrid? Is Ingrid here?
Yes, sir.
You want to present today or next week?
I cannot share the screen, but
Okay, that's the offer for this. It's kind of offer.
sir,
Yes.
I want to share the screen that I can because I think because I'm not the co-host.
So you need to present it now, yeah? Yes or no? I think 15 minutes is enough. Do you want to do it now?
Yes, sir.
Yes or no? I'm clear.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so friend, please just pay attention to the presentation and then we'll discuss further next week, yeah, the discussions. Okay, good. I will let you host. English do not is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Today I want to a presentation about post-colonialism with my friend in the country. What is post-colonialism? Post-colonialism is the critical academic study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. Defined in anthropology as the relation between European nations and areas they colonized and once were, post-colonialism comprises a set of theories found amongst history, anthropology, philosophy, linguistics, film, political science, architecture, human, geography, sociology, marxist theory, feminism, religious and theological studies and literature. Post-colonial history. The British disengagement from its Second Empire from the 19th and the 20th centuries under the colonization movement in Africa and elsewhere in the 1960s and 1970s. Many of the international principles and instruments of decolonization were formally declared during the latter era through their emergence and formation dates back much further, and the language of national self-determination was applied to the liberationist movement within former colonial territories. The process triggered by those struggles were not only political and economic but also cultural. Previously subjugated individuals sought to assert control over not only territorial boundaries, albeit once carved out by the imperial powers, but also their national state. The term of post-colonialism is also sometimes used to refer to the struggle of indigenous people in many parts of the world in the early 21st century. One of the central themes of post-colonial scholarship is the persistence of empire and resistance to the history of imperialism between the 6th and 18th century is the America, the West Indies, Australasia, and Southeast Asia was substantially different from that of the 19th and 20th century. Many of the most powerful local indigenous critics of empire in the 20th century were themselves deeply influenced by European social and political theory as much as they were deeply uh, critical of it. It is difficult to define the Enlightenment as there is no such thing as the Enlightenment, but rather multiple enlightenments shaped by different historical and political contexts. The bundle of concepts and ideals to which the Enlightenment refers is plural and capable of a wide range of elaboration. It can be used to criticize the injustice of societies as well as imperialism itself. This is the African American post-colonial studies. African American studies has been one of the most influential and intellectual, social, and political movements, not only affecting the U.S. but also influencing many people who have suffered oppression from racial discrimination in other parts of the world. The fact that the group of African people were shipped under conditions of slavery makes the relationship between that institution and the wider practice of imperialism central to and understanding of the origin of African American culture. They also shed light on the violence that was often hidden beneath the civilizing rhetoric of imperialism. The history of the struggle self-determination by African Americans is historically intertwined with wider movement of diasporic African struggles for independence. For example, figures like Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey played a central role in the American struggle for self-determination. The Back to Africa movement that he initiated and which has infinities with the modern West Indian movement of Rastafarianism, supported the various movements to return African Americans to Africa. The national flag of Liberia, which was founded specifically to facilitate the return of the black slaves to the native continent, still bears the single star of Garvey Black Starship in context. The postcolonial theory. Postcolonial theory is a body of thought primarily concerned with accounting for the political, aesthetic, economic, historical, and social impact of European colonial rule around the world in the 18th through the 20th century. It focused on reading and writing literature from previously or currently colonized countries. The literature written by colonizing countries about colonization or colonized people. The term of post-colonial theory refers to the theoretical and critical observation of former Western power colonies and how they relate to and interact with the rest of the world. Particularly interest in the cultures of the colonizer and the colonized seeks to critically investigate what happens when two cultures collide and one of them ideologically position itself as superior and assume dominance and control over the other. There are three people who found the postcolonial studies. There is Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and Mani K. Baba. Edward said that Edward is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, New York, born in 1935 years old and died in 23. He soon became the best-known American advocate for the Palestinians. In his book at 1978, Orientalism, re-elaborated entire historical tradition of European American Orientalism and postcolonial. This is the term popularized by Edward Said, Orientalism, in which he examines the process by which the Orient was and continues to be constructed in European thinking. Professional Orientalists include scholars in various disciplines such as language, history, and philology, but for Said, this course of Orientalism was much more widespread and endemic in European thought. Said discussed Orientalism as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. The significance of Orientalism is that, as a mode of knowing the other, it was a supreme example of the construction of the other, a form of authority. The Orient is not an aspect of nature, but a phenomenon constructed by generation of intellectuals, artists, commentators, writers, politicians, and more importantly, constructed by the naturalizing of a wide range of Orientalist assumptions and stereotypes. Next, there is Gayatri Chakravarti. She is as one of the three co-founders of postcolonial theory, and her main work is on the postcolonial theory with critique of postcolonialism toward a history of ancient Islam. Her work combines Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction. Fundamental to Steve theory is the concept of subculture. Feminism is the belief in women's equality in social, economic, and political matters. Although it originated primarily in the West, feminism is now found all over the world and is represented by a variety of institutions dedicated to advancing women's rights and interests. Marxism, named after Karl Marx, Marxism is a social, political, and economic philosophy. It investigates the impact of capitalism on labor, productivity, and economic development, and it advocates for a worker revolution to denounce capitalism and replace it with communism. The construction invented by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who lived from 1930 until 2004. The discussion is a method of analyzing the relationship between text and subculture. The subaltern is a military term which means of lower rank. She borrowed this term from Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. In her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Shows the earliest political historiography shaped the voice of the subaltern group. She is known for her best-known essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? She writes herself sometimes as the woman as a marginal awkward special guest, as the American publisher, and being one in middle class exile, and sometimes as a success story in the star system of American academic life. In this essay, she exposed the irony that the subaltern have awakened to a consciousness of their own rights by making practical deterrence against unjust domination and inequality. She denounced the harm done to women, third world women, and non-Europeans. She wants to give voice to the subaltern who cannot speak or who are silent. She focused on speculation made on legal sacrifice. She attempts to restore the presence of the women writers who have been submerged by their peers. She also investigated a woman double colonization. Feminism and postcolonial. Feminism is a crucial interest to postcolonial discourse for two major reasons. First, both patriarchy and imperialism can be seen as a analogous form of domination over those wherein is predominant. Second, there have been vigorous debates in a number of colonized societies over whether gender of or colonial oppression is the more important political factor in women's life. In the 1980s, many feminist critics began to argue that Western feminism, which had assumed that gender overrode cultural differences to create a universal category of the womanly or the feminine, was operating from hidden, universalist assumption within the class Eurocentric bias. Feminism was therefore charged with failing to counter adequately with the experience of the women. In this respect, the issues concerning gender face similar problems with those concerned with class. Increasingly, feminism has been concerned with categories like gender may sometimes be ignored in intellectual information of the colonial, and that post-colonial theory has tended to ally gender difference in constructing a single category of the colonized. These critics argue that colonialism operated very differently for women and for men, and the double colonization that resulted when women were subject both to general discrimination as colonial subject and specific discrimination as women needs to be taken into account in any analysis of colonial approach. Next, maybe.
Fumi Baba was born in 1949, is one of the Indian post-colonial terrorists. There is always ambivalence on at the site of colonial dominance, ambivalence constructed through mimicry and hybridity. He wrote The Nation and Narration in 1990. Here he considered how to conceptualize the nation under colonialism and take issue with the anthropologist Benedict Anderson's view of the relationship between imperialism and its resistance in imagined communities. Next. Hybridity, the fusion of two traditions of which create new transcultural elements and produce a double identity that contradicted as a colonizer and colonized at the same time. In literature, it causes ambivalence and confusing whether it is opposing or supporting colonialism, because post-colonial texts supposed to uncontaminated by the colonialist concept. Next. Mimicry. From the theory of Homike Bava, mimicry is a concept of imitating colonizers' behavior intended to mock, which can appear as a parody in literature. It's a sort of anti-colonial movement in literature that producing social political works. Mimicry is a severe criticism as an implement to resist colonialization. The most radical anti-colonial writers often called the mimic man. Next. Neocolonialism. Neocolonialism, meaning new colonialism, was a term coined by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president, the first president of Ghana and the leading exponent of Pan-Africanism in his neocolonialism. The last stage of imperialism, this title, which echoed Lenin's definition of imperialism as the last stage of capitalism, suggested that although countries like Ghana had achieved political independence, the ex-colonial powers and the newly emerging superpowers such as the United States continued to play a decisive role in their cultures and economics through new instruments of indirect control such as international monetary bodies. Through the power of multinational corporations and cartels, which artificially fix prices in world markets, and through a variety of other educational and cultural NGOs. In fact, Nkrumah argued that colonialism was more insidious and more difficult to detect and resist than the direct control exercised by classic colonialism. The term has since been widely used to refer to any and all forms of control of the ex-colonies after political independence. Thus, for example, it has been argued by some that the new elites brought to power by independence and often educated and trained by the colonialist powers were unrepresentative of the people and act as unwitting or even willing agents for the former colonial rulers. Next. Post-colonial criticism. Post-colonial criticism is similar to cultural studies, but it assumes a unique perspective on literature and politics that warrants a separate discussion. Specifically, post-colonial critics are concerned with literature produced by colonial powers and work produced by those who are colonized. Next. Characteristic of post-colonial criticism. An awareness of representation of non-Europeans was as exotic or other. Concern with language, some conclude the colonizer language is permanently tainted to write in it involves accents, accents in colonial structures. Stress on cross-cultural interaction, emphasis on identity as double or unstable. Next. What post-colonial critics do: reject claims of universalism, examine representation of other cultures, show how literature is silent on matters of imperialism and colonialism, foreground questions of diversity and cultural difference, celebrate cultural polyphency, assert that marginality, plurality, and otherness are sources of energy and potential change. Next. And the conclusion is post-colonialism realized that even though the colonial era has finished yet, but the practices have not come to an end, and now has turned its face into neo-colonialism. Post-colonialism perspective literally works emerge to unveil injustice and discrimination. Post-colonial literature is a kind of literary work which describes realistic experience of what really happens around us. To remind, don't just shut our eyes. It is believed that one voice could lead into a betterment for our future and society. Thank you.
Finish?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for the presentations. It is a long and quite thorough discussion on post-colonialism. I think we still need time later to discuss more about this. Putri and Ingrid, there are two rules that you need to complete. First, as we agreed at the beginning, that when exam we open the video, yeah, so that all of us can feel how it presents. So later in our discussion after Lebaran, so you can do it. So when you talk, you need to open the video, yeah. Number two, in all the group assignment, you need to include the analysis, your own analysis, yeah, using the theory on literary facts, free of your own choice, yeah, the fact that you are going to analyze. So that is still missing in your presentation. I still give you time when we meet in the 25th of May after Lebaran. Be ready to present the example of your analysis. You choose a word, apply this post-colonial theory. There are a lot. You can talk about hybridity by Homi Bhabha, you can talk about Orientalism, the others by Edward Said. You can talk about subaltern by the Indian professors. Yeah. So that is what you need to complete. Okay. So I think keep your question after the next meeting. Yeah. I believe there are a lot of questions. So we'll discuss post-colonial Buddhism again in the next meeting. Okay. So for today it's enough. Thank you very much for your participation. Don't forget to prepare our next presentation, including Fendo and Fred discussing about narratology. And we have also Aditya and friends talking about stylistics. Read the book, yeah, don't forget, and then we'll have a full discussion next time. Okay, until 25th of May. Yeah, bye bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.